Hello, my name is James Hopkins, and today we'll be going over the Battle of Yorktown. So the American Revolutionary War has been going on for about 6 years now, starting in April 1975. George Washington's original plan was to attack New York. He believed that if he won New York, he would win the war. British forces had secured New York, and it was a port for them to transport goods in and out of, and it was a strong point. So General Washington pitched his initial idea to General Rochambeau and other French officers, and they didn't agree with his plan of action. Then news came in that General Cornwallis was fortifying Yorktown. Yorktown is in Virginia, and he had been campaigning throughout the Carolinas leading up to Virginia, trying to fight General Lafayette's forces. He wasn't successful, but he did end up fortifying and capturing Yorktown. There was the Battle of the Chesapeake Bay, where he lost some of his naval fleet, and then he got news from General Clinton, the British commander-in-chief, that he was getting sent additional forces to help him fortify Virginia, and he got specific orders to hold Yorktown and build up his fortifications there. So Washington and Rochambeau created a plan to make a trip down with all of his forces to Yorktown. They went from New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia, and in what is the largest troop movement ever. As you can see over on the map, this is the route that the Continental Army took. And down here near North Carolina, leading up into Virginia, you can see some of the battles that General Cornwallis's army had with General Lafayette. And General Lafayette would hold off General Cornwallis's forces in time for them to make it down here and secure their positions and prepare for the Battle of Yorktown. Along this route, Washington's main concern was secrecy. So with the help of his secret spy ring that he had in New York and some of the Franco-American allegiance that he was able to send elements out from the formation to distract General Clinton's forces and kind of get them off of the main element, the main body that was moving. September 14th, 1781, General Washington's forces arrived at Williamsburg, Virginia. From there, they'd go to the Chesapeake Bay to receive ammunition, supplies, and additional French allies to add to George Washington's Continental Army, giving him a grand total of 7,800 French soldiers, 3,100 militiamen, and 8,000 Continentals. In the early hours of September 28th, Washington led his forces to Yorktown, Virginia, where you can see here the Continental Army and General Washington's American forces took the traditional right flank. And over here on the left flank, we have General Rochambeau's French forces. Now, if you look over here, we have General Cornwallis's fortification over here. And throughout the marshland, we have redoubts. Now, these redoubts are strategically placed. There's about 10 of them, and then the last two over here, 9 and 10, just remember those. Those will be very important later on in the battle. And over here near Gloucester, Massachusetts, we have additional fortification with more redoubts, and kind of gives suppressive fire over here towards any of the French fleet that's remaining. So George Washington scouted this area, he did some recon on it, and he came up with the plan that he would conduct a siege on Yorktown. And he decided that the best way, the most effective means of attack was sending artillery rounds and bombarding Cornwallis, because he believed that he could not hold Yorktown. So the map we were looking at before in the previous slide was a map created in 1785 of the Battle of Yorktown. that I found on the Library of Congress's website. If you look over here, we have a more updated map provided by the American Battlefield Trust Association. And here you can see the Continental Army forces. You can see the American forces over here, French forces over here, Cornwallis's fortifications of Yorktown, Gloucester, Massachusetts fortifications over here. You can see the different generals' forces, like General Tarleton. And then over here you have some of the battlefield facts. These numbers kind of differentiate depending on the sources that you get, but they're roughly 1,000 off or below or above, depending on where your source is from. But here you can see that the American forces greatly outweighed the British, almost in like a 3-to-1 odds. The news of General Washington's Continental Army in pursuit, Cornwallis decided that he needed to fortify Yorktown. He's under the assumption that General Clinton was going to supply him with additional forces, so he didn't think that he'd be able to be besieged. Cornwallis had promised him 5,000 additional British soldiers, so in Cornwallis's eyes, it was an easy victory for him. With the news of reinforcements, Cornwallis decided to pull back his forces from the redoubts. As you can see, the little red markers there. He decided to pull back his forces to fortify the walls with gabions and fascines, as you can see right here. So gabions are reeds that are pushed together to create kind of barriers on top of the walls. Since Yorktown didn't have any large rocks or boulders or anything they could move up there, gabions were wicker baskets that they could weave together, stuffed with smaller rocks, and then fortify them with fascines up top, which were just bundles of sticks. And then they would put their cannons in between this, spaced out on redoubts throughout the town to help them fortify their positions. So both of the armies were in place now. You had the Americans' forces established. They had their headquarters, and they were preparing to march out. And by September 29th, that is when Cornwallis decided to pull out his outer defenses and bring all of his men within the confines of Yorktown. So when preparing for the Battle of Yorktown, both British and American forces had 62 artillery cannons. What made American artillery stronger than British artillery was that Cornwallis's artillery was more focused on mobility rather than firepower. When he was campaigning through the North Carolinas and up to Virginia, he was more focused on mobility and trying to get those cannons in place and be able to move them out. The French and Continental Army had 20 18-pounder and 30 24-pound artillery cannons. So they had the firepower, and as you can see over here are the different types of artillery cannons and their ranges and some of the capabilities that they have. So American forces in place cannons along the 2,000-yard entrenchment stretching from the head of Yorktown to the York River, which is the first parallel which we're going to be getting to that they established. Patriot forces used 18 and 24-pounder siege cannons, field guns, mortars, and howitzers, as you can see over to the right. Cannons have a maximum effective range. Now, these are all kind of rough estimates of 2,000 yards for the cannons. Mortars have a range of 1,400 yards, and howitzers with a 1,300-yard range. And the Continental Army was well within range of Yorktown, especially from the first and then going to the second parallel. So on October 6th, the first parallel or siege line was established, spanning 2,000 yards with both American and French. American depicted with the blue there on the right, and then French forces depicted on the left there, and British obviously up there in Yorktown in red. The first trench was about 600 and 900 yards away from Yorktown, so well within range as we discussed prior with the American artillery. After fortifying the American-led parallel siege line, General Washington opened fire on the British at 5 p.m. on October 9th, and he laid down 3,500 rounds each day that he was firing on Yorktown, so it was just a constant bombardment. On this slide, we have a kind of an overview of a map that gives you a topographical view created in 1785 from the Library of Congress. The one on the left here is just a zoomed out version over here. It's kind of a close-up. You can see the siege lines or the parallels that Washington established. And we zoom in here, we can see the artillery emplaced, the French over here, and then the American over here. From October 9th to October 11th of 1781, General Washington's forces laid down a constant bombardment of American artillery rounds on Yorktown. General Cornwallis's forces were diminishing, and to bring the fight closer to him, General Washington ordered a second parallel to be made 400 yards closer to British lines, as you can see here. Cornwallis didn't realize that the forces had moved and was still attacking the first parallel or first siege line. To extend the second parallel's lines, you can see that the American forces built a second trench perpendicular off to a right angle to attack Redoubts 9 and 10, which were British fortifications. In order for General Washington to extend out the second parallel, he knew that he had to capture British Redoubts 9 and 10 that bordered the eastwardly banks of the York River near Yorktown. These redoubts were the last line of defense for the British soldiers from southern attack. And redoubts are typically earthwork fortifications that are commonly square or polygon in shape and that are easily defendable and typically impervious towards flanking combatants. So, on October 14th, a French detachment, as you can see here, led by General de Viomenil, began their attack on Redoubt 9. And then at the same time, General Lafayette and Lieutenant Colonel Hamilton's American armies and American detachment attacked Redoubt 10. Each element, both French and American, totaled 400 soldiers and overpowered Redoubt number 9 that was occupied by 120 British and Hessian soldiers. Hessians were their German mercenaries that were for hire, that worked with the British soldiers. And Redoubt 10 was occupied by 70 British soldiers. French and American soldiers, when they attacked these redoubts, they didn't attack them with any ammunition, any firearms. They attacked them with bayonets and hand-to-hand combats. It was very bloody, and the French were able to capture 100 British soldiers and Hessian soldiers, killing dozens of them, while the American soldiers were able to capture all 70 over at Redoubt 10. And as you can see here, this is what the French and American forces would see as they were climbing into the redoubts, and the wooden spikes that line them are called abatis, and they had to break through those, climb over them, and attack forces. So General Washington's siege of Yorktown was well underway. After the assault of Redoubt 9 and 10, the Patriots were able to complete their second parallel, the second siege line, as you can see here. Once that was complete, the American forces were ready for a second bombardment. They had all of the French artillery, as you can see over here on the left, and then they had American artillery over here on the right. On the night of October 15th, Cornwallis attempted to counter the Continental Army, but his efforts were in vain, and by the morning, the Patriots were able to repair all their artillery rounds and all of their guns. As you can see there, he tried to attack, and it was unsuccessful. And in the morning of the 16th, Cornwallis attempted to escape Yorktown by boat. He tried to get through the York River, but was intercepted by the French fleet and an impending storm, as you can see there. And he tried to evacuate his soldiers through Gloucester, Massachusetts, but all of this was unsuccessful. And on October 17th, the Patriots laid out just massive bombardment, artillery rounds that just kept raining down on the British forces. and Cornwallis knew that he could no longer hold Yorktown. As you can see there, the bombardment came down. Now this of course isn't an accurate depiction of how many cannons were firing on there, but it kind of gives you an idea. And at 10 o'clock a.m., white flag rose from Yorktown, signaling the British surrender. A British officer came out with a drummer and marched to General Washington himself and handed him a letter of surrender along with a ceasefire. And then on October 19th, official British surrender was signed, and it was followed by a ceremonial march which the British conducted in front of the Continental Army and General Washington himself. October 19th, 1781, the Battle of Yorktown was complete, and General Washington had successfully sieged Yorktown under General Cornwallis's command. They could no longer hold the fort. It was up in flames, and at the end of the day, British forces had lost 156 men, 326 were wounded, and 70 were missing, and Cornwallis would eventually surrender 7,087 of his own officers enlisted to American forces 5 days after the battle ended on October 24th, 1781. Clinton's forces finally arrived by the British fleet, and he was able to take several of his officers, including Cornwallis, back, as well as American loyalists, back to Britain. The French casualties were 60 killed and 194 wounded. And American casualties were 28 killed and 107 wounded, a grand total of 88 killed and 301 wounded. Washington moved his army to Windsor, New York, where they remained until Benjamin Franklin went over to Great Britain, and they signed the Treaty of Paris, which marked the end for the Revolutionary War and won American independence on September 3rd, 1783. This concludes my presentation for the Battle of Yorktown. I hope you learned a little bit more about it. I enjoyed researching this topic. I'll be making a trip up to Yorktown, Virginia to explore the battlefield. So thank you for giving me your time.